Oh, welcome back. Okay, so to start off, we're going to do a quick exercise. Um, where do we find kinship? And what about modern ideas of social clans? Where do we find people that we share kinship with? So we have sort of our traditional ideas, family and our like, direct descendants or ancestors and brothers and sisters, the biological aspect of family. But kinship isn't just associated with biology. So we also find friendships, right? And not just friendships, but we're talking about, friendships that we consider to be family. For example, my best friend, who I have known for 33 years now. We went to elementary school together, and we have been friends ever since. He is closer to me than most of my family. Certainly closer to me than most of my extended family, cousins and stuff like that. So, our relationship and my relationship to his wife and to their kid is one where I am an uncle to their child, right? That's what my name is. I'm Uncle Joe. And those bonds are extremely tight. And our relationship is that if one was in need, the other would help immediately, right? So there's a different type of kinship, right? You have close friends that are like family, that you would do the same things for had they been directly related to you. But that's sort of that's kind of a choice thing, right? We develop those sort of relationships over time, especially when you have best friends or you have people that you've been associated with a long time. There's other ways of creating that kind of kinship as well. One place where we oftentimes find kinship is with, for example, like the military. When you go into the military, everyone shares the same experiences. You all have to go through basic, right? You all have to get certain training. You all experience the military life in a particular way. And so that your connection to other people who have been in the military, and for those that you spend a lot of time with, that time together can oftentimes be very intense. And so intense relationships that are shared create bonds. And so even though, you might have met them at a fairly older age, those bonds will oftentimes last a lifetime. So military is a great example of kinship. There are some workplace kinships that you might find. Not every workplace is going to have it, but you might find a place where you go to work and everybody, or maybe certain people you meet there, become like family, or you spend enough time with them that they get drawn into that kinship relationship. And there are other societies, modern social clans. I think one of the fascinating things to look at is gamers. And gaming clans and relationships that are oftentimes virtual, and sort of imaginary, but still extremely strong in relationship. So you might be living in this gaming world, this fantasy world, but you end up spending a lot of time with these other folks, and they might be working within a different persona, but it's still this kindred relationship where sharing of resources and sharing of alliances and stuff like that is still going to be practiced. So we still organize ourselves in different ways, even given wildly different circumstances or completely fantastical fantasy circumstances where you have people that form clans, and they are a clan. And it's fascinating to kind of look at how this all happens. You have other processes through. Oftentimes, it's shared intense experiences. One of the things that I found fascinating within my own experience is how I would go to these field schools where we would go camping for 2 months out in the desert with no running water, no electricity, no cell phone service. And you would have to basically, make friends really quickly with the people that you're working with. And what I found was that some of these folks became family members, to the point where I became a godfather to a couple that I met. They met down at one of our field schools, got married a few years afterwards. They met down there and started dating and doing all that stuff, and got married. And I was the best man at the wedding. And then they had a kid, and I became, again, an uncle, not by blood, but by choice. And there's so many of these relationships that can be formed from these experiences that, it's fascinating to watch how people come together given something that's happening, right? So, how we organize the people in our lives that really matter can help us understand how others organize their families, and how other folks will figure out, like, this is, in times of need, this is where I'll go. And when people are hurting, they can come to me, even if we're not blood related, right? We have those ability to share resources, share time, and share our presence. So kinship is not just related to blood ties, but to these outside folks that become a major part of our lives at some point. And even if they do grow distance, those relationships can still be maintained. Let's see here. So for the most part, I just talked about all this. Families can oftentimes be chosen, okay, and this is how we deal with, like, adopted children, not blood related, but they're still your kids, right? Or they're still your brothers and sisters, or they're still your aunts and uncles, even though, again, not related by blood, but they're related by choice, by culture, by sort of shared experience, right? I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, this idea of how globalization is changing the nuclear family. Traditionally, we look at how in a lot of cultures, families were oftentimes multi-generational and would be, might include aunts and uncles and their partners and their kids all in one location on a farm. This was oftentimes the case in agricultural areas where families would pull together, work together, and survive together. When the United States became more globalized, when we could find work across the country and be able to affordably move there, it changed the idea of the nuclear family. It changed this idea that we had to stay in the same location to survive, that we could actually survive with a smaller family group, and we could follow the work. So we could immigrate to a new location to find that work, and that happened as work diversified. There were more jobs that were created, and not only more jobs, but more types of jobs that weren't always necessarily related to agricultural or industrial practices. So your ability to travel changed, and that became the norm for the United States. In fact, you were sort of expected to move out of the house as soon as you became an adult. And oftentimes, that was, at the age of like 18, 19, you were expected to get your own place. And to, that's also the time that you're looking at getting married, or maybe going to college if college was an option. And that's sort of changed a little bit as well. Even our modern ideas about this is definitely changed. But it's interesting to look at how sort of the modern family and the rights and responsibilities of kids have adopted, from being one where we were expected to stay at home and to work on the family business or family farm, to leaving as soon as we come of age to start our own lives and follow our own paths. So there's been a fairly wide shift in American culture when we look at how families have adapted to new circumstances. So economic mobility became a lot easier. And we started changing all of this, all of these different ideals about what it was like to live on our own. As I said, that wasn't always the case. So here's another exercise. Why has there been an increase in children between the ages of 18 and 34, either going back and living at home or staying at home? And this is a pretty big shift. It's 30%. So just about 1 in 3 adults have gone back, and the term that I've heard oftentimes used is like boomerang kids. They might leave for a little while and then come back, and leave for a little while and come back. And they might spend a few years at home in their early to late 20s, early 30s, until they finally make that permanent break. Why is this? Why is this the case that we're seeing these big changes? This comes down to a couple of different things. And I think the big thing to look at here is economics. Okay? If you live in Denver, which pretty much all of you do, or at least in the surrounding areas of Denver, what's one of the biggest issues that we're facing as Coloradans, as Denverites? And that comes down to economics, right? What can you afford versus what's available? Now, if we go back to the 50s and 60s, if you were an 18-year-old and you left your home, you could find a decent paying job. And if you were living in a city, you could afford rent, and you could afford a living wage, and you could buy a car, and you could do all that kind of stuff. If you were a guy, if you were a woman, that might also be different, because there's also gender issues here as well. But in this case, the cost of living was much lower. Now, when it's so expensive to buy a home, and when average wages are fairly low to the average person, being able to buy a home isn't that easy. Even renting isn't that easy anymore. You could rent an apartment for fairly cheap, and now like the average price in Denver is between, it's like $1,200 and $1,800 a month. I mean, wow, that's a lot just to get an apartment. And so you've got to have a good job, or you've got to have a lot of roommates, or you end up having economic help from parents. And oftentimes that ends up changing so that you just go and live with your parents. And I think it's important to understand that, because in our culture, there is a certain amount of ridicule that comes with living at home, living with your parents, living with other family members, because there's this idea that you can't make it on your own. And I find that rather ridiculous given our circumstances, that the ability to afford buying a house versus renting. And that's also a fascinating thing to look at as well, is that oftentimes renting is more expensive than having a mortgage. But depending on your credit rating and what kind of job you have can determine whether or not you can own something. And we'll be touching a lot on the housing market and how it's organized when we talk about poverty and inequality in one of our next lectures. But in this circumstance, it's a huge issue. It's an absolutely huge issue. And how do we transfer money from from our parents to us, to our kids? How do we transfer resources, and how do we pass that along? And it's changed dramatically over the years of what we find available. So that's something to think about. And then we also have sort of the changes of what we consider to be like the perfect family, the sort of like the American dream, of being able to like buy a house, get married, have 2.4 kids, a dog, possibly a cat. I wouldn't call it ideal having a cat. I would say dogs are ideal, but some of you like cats, so that's cool, I guess. Whatever. This has all changed, right? Our ideas and our expectations of what it's like to have the ideal family is very different from what it used to be. So understanding, how these things have changed over time, right? If you were living with your girlfriend or boyfriend, it used to be considered to be living in sin, right? You were living in sin. You weren't married. You were doing sinful things with each other, and that was frowned upon greatly. Now it's kind of expected. In fact, you should definitely live with your girlfriend or boyfriend before you get married, because you want to find out whether or not you're going to be a good match, right? By living together. And so that's changed. That dynamic has changed. So looking at how cultures deal with marriage and their relationship with each other, and how that's changing. The idea of a nuclear family, where you break off and form your own family, has sort of encouraged this idea of being able to live with each other before you get married, right? It was frowned upon if you moved in together when you had big families, because you leaving those families, right? If you had this large extended family over here and they had a large extended family and you both moved out and started your own, that was selfish, right? That was seen as selfish because you were no longer contributing to either family. But now we have this idealized nuclear family, small groups, and so it's like, oh, this isn't too far out of the realm. So living in sin, is not nearly as bad as it used to be, if at all, in our own culture. Blending families, having kids or having kids out of wedlock. Oh man, we go back to the 50s and prior, and you had a kid out of wedlock. For the guy, it wasn't that big of a deal, right? You'd be seen as irresponsible, but, for women, it was really bad, right? It was really bad for that to take place. Now, not so much, right? There's still oftentimes a bit of stigma that might be attached to women that have kids out of wedlock, but it's becoming such a large phenomenon that here eventually it's not going to be an issue. There's going to be no problems with having kids out of wedlock for men or women, because marriage as an institution isn't always seen as needed, or having that other person as an extra resource isn't always as needed. So these different ideas about families and how we choose to get married and why we get married and who we get married to has changed pretty drastically, considering where it was 100 years ago. Okay, so in conclusion to our discussion on kinship and marriage and family, we find that different people can be related to us in different ways, right? You've got the biological family, the people that you're directly related to through blood relationships, but we also find the people outside the friends and the people that we share experiences with and tight bonds with that also become that extended kinship member. We have found that there are different descent patterns to look at: patrilineal, matrilineal, and bilineal. That follows both patra and matrilineal practices. We've looked at 6 different types of kinship, and how families can be organized and what the rights and responsibilities of these families and what they look like. One thing that I'd like you to think about is comparing, say, like our own ideas on kinship and family. So our contemporary issues like the Eskimo pattern, where we have one set of parents and then we have aunts and uncles and then cousins, and then compare it to, say, like the Hawaiian, where every one of our parents' generation, all of our aunts and uncles act like our parents, right? And they take on those responsibilities as parents and can do everything that our own parents can do. What would that look like? How do you think you would grow up in that community? Where all of your cousins are considered to be brothers and sisters. There's no word for cousin, right? It's brother and sister, right? There's those rights and responsibilities to them, are just as important as your own immediate brothers and sisters. What does that look like? And I want you to kind of think about that a little bit. Try and place your own thoughts and ideas and look at your cousins now, and how many of them would you consider to be that close, to being brothers or sisters, or your aunts and uncles. Did they ever take on that role of parent with you, right? Or would they ever have been given the chance to? I think it's really interesting to kind of do like a little thought experiment, given this sort of ideal. Marriages, continuing on, marriages can be diverse in structure, but are found in every culture, right? There's everywhere we look at, we can find marriages. They're not always structured like how we see them here. And they might have different rights and responsibilities. So understanding how those structures are organized and how people behave in those given circumstances, it's very good to understand why, what's going on there. We also looked at how marriages can be affected by marrying outside of your clan or your family group, and what happens when you marry inside, and different economic strategies for choosing or having a spouse chosen for you, right? So the ideas of marrying for love versus marrying for alliances, having those arranged marriages. Kinship is found within the family and with others who share the same ideals and necessities, who have those same events or shared events that can have a big impact on your life. That you shared something, whether it be like the experience of being in the military, or a particular school event, or maybe you're gamers, or maybe there's so many different things, so many different organizations that you can find that kind of kinship. My mom, for an example, was in the Colorado Women's Fly Fishing Club, and through that community, she met some people that became practically like family, right? That they helped their respective kids out. They would go on trips together, share resources, all of this stuff, all because they met because they had an interest in fly fishing. But because of shared experiences and shared ideals, they were able to come to find fast and strong friendship that went beyond just friendship. Something to consider. How we look at families in general, especially like the nuclear family, has changed not only our ideas of what the ideal family looks like, but has changed through globalism what a lot of countries around the world think of as the ideal family, and what that kind of looks like as we become more industrialized and find more and more people moving from rural communities to urbanized communities, and following immigration patterns. We can see how people are changing where they get married or who they get married to. So understanding what is an ideal, we're seeing changes in those practices. What was once inappropriate now is considered okay, right? And so we're following these different practices, and it's amazing within our own culture, because we're so big and we're so complex. We have a lot of wiggle room, for dealing with these ideas about marriage. In other communities that might be smaller, more tight-knit, and might not be as diversified, having these ideas come in might have either a very strong negative impact or possibly even a positive impact if it aligns with previous ideals within that community. So I think it's fascinating to kind of look at this and how we organize ourselves as people in the people within our circles, our kinship circles. Whether you have a lot of biological family, or you have more chosen family, and I think it's really important to look at those, especially as an anthropologist, whatever culture you're looking at as a researcher, or even examining your own and where you fit within that community. It's important to look at and to understand. Yeah, I guess that's it. So let's see, homework. Write about what we've talked about in class, in these lectures, or what you found in the textbook. Give me some of your ideas on kinship. Take a look at the exercises and see if there's something that you thought of. And then also in the discussions, what do you think about kinship? And what do you think about people that have these shared experiences? And where do you fall in that? Do you have kinship outside of your family? Is there a group that you have become associated with, or certain friends that you have those same sort of bonds with that could be considered family? Yeah. Okay. So I'm pretty sure that's it. I hope that you all have a great rest of your week, and we shall see you on the flip side. Okay? Adios.